Welcome to 21st Sports Recap and Reaction for the St. Louis Rams at the Minnesota Vikings in their Week 9 matchup, played November 8, 2015. We're going to go over the scores and the stats and give our breakdown and analysis. So starting off in the first quarter, a little less than 5 minutes in, Blair Walsh hit a 34-yard field goal to make it 3-0 Minnesota over St. Louis. Then with about 5.5 still left in the first quarter, Adrian Peterson scored on a 6-yard touchdown. Walsh added the extra point, and it was 10-0 Vikings over the Rams. But then with just over a minute left in the first, the Rams got on the scoreboard as Todd Gurley punched in from a yard out. They missed the extra point, so now it was 10-6 as they cut the Vikings lead to 4. So now on to the second quarter. With about 11 minutes left before halftime, Greg Zuerlein hit a 61-yard field goal to make it a 1-point game with the score Minnesota 10, St. Louis 9. Then with about 3.5 left before halftime, Zuerlein hit a 35-yard field goal, and that gave St. Louis the lead 12-10. And on the last play of the first half, Zuerlein hit a 45-yard field goal to make it 15-10. St. Louis over Minnesota. Zuerlein put up the only points in the second quarter with 3 field goals. And now in the third quarter, Bridgewater would take it in from 6 yards out, and then he would score for the 2-point conversion, making quite the play, coming around, getting it in. And it was now 18-15 as the Vikings took back the lead with about 8.5 minutes left in the third. Bridgewater would leave the game due to a concussion early in the fourth, and Shaun Hill would take over. And the Rams actually had a chance to tie the game with a 48-yard field goal. Zuerlein missed, but he would get another opportunity with less than half a minute left in regulation. And this time Zuerlein kicked it in from 53 yards out, and this game was tied at 18. So this game would go to overtime. And on the first possession of overtime, the Rams got the ball first. On the first play of overtime, Todd Gurley was stuffed for a 6-yard loss. And then the drive would result in a 3-and-out on that possession as they would end up punting from their own 14. So now Minnesota would take over on their own 49 after a 26-yard return on the punt by Schroels. And then you just kept giving the ball to Adrian Peterson until they were in field goal range. And Blair Walsh came out to attempt a 40-yard field goal. It was up, it was good, and the Minnesota Vikings win 21-18 in overtime. They're undefeated at home, 4-0, 6-2 on this season. And with the loss by Green Bay to Carolina at the same time, it would end up now with the tie for first place between the Vikings and the Packers. So the Vikings are tied for first place in the NFC North with this victory. The Rams are now at 500 on the season at 4-4. They are 1-3 on the road. So how about that performance by Minnesota? Even without Bridgewater, Shaun Hill comes in, doesn't really do much, but Peterson was moving the ball on the ground. And their defense was coming up huge as their defense was shutting down the Rams' offense. They held Gurley to under 100 yards as he had been explosive going off. He did get, 89 yards in the game, but they were able to hold him to where they didn't, they only let up the one touchdown by Gurley in this game, and that was early on in the first quarter. Well, it was at the end of the first quarter, but early on in the game. And the Rams would not get back in the end zone. They would end up settling for 4 field goals as the Minnesota defense really plays excellent at home. They play to a whole nother level when they're in Minnesota. They really step up big time. But in this game, for the Vikings, Bridgewater before leaving the game was 13 for 21, 144 passing yards, 1 interception. Hill was just 2 for 6 for 15 passing yards as he came in the fourth. Adrian Peterson, 29 carries, 125 yards, and a touchdown. He also had 2 receptions for 18 yards, which gave him 143 total yards in the game. Bridgewater also had 3 carries for 17 yards and that rushing touchdown as well. And Stephon Diggs, the rookie, 3 receptions for 42 yards. Rudolph, 2 receptions for 30 yards. And for the Rams, Nick Foles, 18 for 33, 168 passing yards, no touchdowns, no interceptions. Todd Gurley, 24 carries for 89 yards and a touchdown. And Tavon Austin, 8 carries for 66 yards. Austin also had 4 receptions for 15 yards in this game, giving him 81 total yards. And Kenny Britt had 3 receptions for 87 yards. Gurley also had 3 receptions for 20 yards, which gave him 109 total yards in the game, but he was under 100 on the ground. Then we look at the kickers, and Blair Walsh was perfect, 2 for 2 on the field goals, 1 for 1 on the extra points. Zerline, 4 for 5 on the field goals, did not attempt an extra point. And so then we look at the defense, and on defense, Joseph had a hat sack, Sendeo had a half a sack, and then for the Rams, Alexander had a sack, and Johnson had an interception. Ayers had a forced fumble. And for the first downs, 21 for Minnesota, 18 for St. Louis. On third down, 3 for 13 for Minnesota, just 23%. 2 for 16 for St. Louis, as they converted just 12% on third down. They went for it once on fourth, and they did convert that. Then we look at the net yards. 320 for the Rams, 293 for the Vikings. On the ground, the Rams 160 netted, 145 netted by the Vikings. And through the air, 160 netted by the Rams, 148 netted by the Vikings. And Foles was sacked once for a loss of 8 yards. And then the 1 sack against Bridgewater for a loss of 11 yards. Then we look at the penalties. A lot of penalties against the Rams. They're really shooting themselves in the foot in this game. 12 penalties for 87 penalty yards. Just 6 penalties against the Vikings for 67 penalty yards. So half as many penalties, although just 20 more penalty yards against the Rams. But it's the timeliness of the penalties that really hurt them. Then we look at the red zone. 2 for 3 for Minnesota, 66%. 1 for 2 for St. Louis, just 50%. And on the time of possession, 33 minutes and 13 seconds for Minnesota, 32 minutes, 27 seconds for the Rams. And of course, they played about 5.5, almost 6 minutes into overtime. But the Minnesota Vikings coming up big. It was a real defensive battle in this game, a lot of punts back and forth. And even with the interception, the Rams weren't able to capitalize on that and turn it into points, as the defense came up big, forced a 3-and-out when that happened. And so the Minnesota Vikings defense has them tied for first place. Also the strength of their running game. And Bridgewater, he was getting it done. Not so much big numbers, but he did get that touchdown on the ground. He did leave, and he should be all right. He should be good to go next week. The team rallying around him and rallying around Hill and getting the job done. He said they come up big on defense. They're making big plays, breaking up passes and shutting down the passing game for St. Louis. Of course, Todd Gurley is really the focal point of their offense. And although he did get 109 total yards, they said only 89 on the ground, which is a decent game. But for what he's been doing, he's been putting up like $140. And, so they were able to kind of rein him in somewhat, and they were able to force St. Louis to have to settle for field goals. They only let him get in the red zone twice and only let him get that 1 red zone touchdown. So the Vikings defense really playing at a high level, especially there in Minnesota. They're a tough team to beat. They have not been beaten at home all season long. And if that trend continues, then they should be able to keep this going towards the postseason. But as it is right now, here in Week 9, they are tied for first place. But let me know what you think in the comments section below. Definitely interested to read your thoughts and opinions. Thank you very much for listening. It's greatly appreciated. I hope you're having a good day and had a great weekend and enjoyed all the sports.